Okay, hi. So, is this working? I can't hear it any different. Oh, there we go. So I'm here to introduce Bob Robert Benavides. Is that how you say it? Benavides? Okay. Close? Say it for me. Benavides. Benavides. Right. Junior, not to be confused with senior. Bob is a licensed psychologist, a licensed marriage and family therapist, a doctor of education. I won't go into the other things you told me. He's been licensed for over 35 years, practices in Santa Rosa here, where he specializes in EMDR consultation, working with bilingual and bicultural people, and trauma and substance abuse counseling. And today, as you know, we have the pleasure of hearing from Bob, hearing him share his expertise on the subject of counseling with Latina and Latino people. He's going to talk about considerations like generational and gender differences, immigration history, and he's going to offer us some templates for treatment and to identify therapist errors that can hinder client progress. He will also present a definition of culture, some models of cultural change, and the role of the family in acculturation. So let's welcome Robert Benavides, Jr. to Recamp.
Probably easier if I stay over here and get away from the speaker over there. Thank you so much for inviting me here. It's been a long time since I had much contact with Recamp, because when I was licensed in '78, it was kind of a viable group, and then all of a sudden it kind of drifted off, and now it's turned into this monster organization with a tremendous membership. So thank you so much for inviting me. What I want to do today, I originally put this presentation together with the idea of kind of trying to cover some of the academic concerns in working with this population, and at the same time mixing in clinical issues. So what I want to do is blow through as quickly as I can through the academic stuff that I think most of you have already had kind of a stomach full in graduate school, and I want to move quickly into some of the clinical concerns. I'm going to encourage that you ask questions, especially here in this county. I'm going to guess that without a truly accurate count, Latino population here has got to be close to between 25 and 30% now. If you move into the heavy populated areas like, say, San Jose and Los Angeles, if you go into LA, you're going to find that the Latino population is broken up into little cities. You're going to go to one area and it's going to be nothing but the Mexican Latinos there. Then you shift over and you're going to see the El Salvadorians that are over there. You might see some of the some Central Americans, and occasionally you're going to see folks that come from South America. Rarely do we see Latinos that come here from the East Coast, because typically that's going to be the Cuban and the Puerto Rican influence over there. And Miami Beach, of course, has the bulk of the Cubans. So here, it's almost impossible to do family therapy without having to take into consideration culture. You might find yourself with a second or third generation Latino that is monolingual English, completely, not even acculturated, but completely anglicized. So when you see that individual that comes in at, say, 16 or 17, you miss the fact that mom might be from El Salvador and dad might be from Mexico, and the kid really was never interested in the language at all. So very typically, you move in that direction thinking, well, I'm hitting all the bases, but you're missing the richness of the culture and the influence back home, or the influence from somebody else in another country. And you think, well, where the heck did this behavior come from that all of a sudden I find myself kind of confused? And it isn't until you bring the family in and you start talking to everybody and you go, well, this is really fascinating that, that maybe grandpa came here as an immigrant, or dad came here as an immigrant. Dad's here illegally. The person that I'm seeing came here at age 2 or 3, didn't realize that he or she was undocumented until they were like 16 or 17, and you go, I never thought about this kind of stuff. And then you ask yourself, well, how do they identify themselves? And oftentimes within one family, you're going to find that the dad might say, never forget that you're a Mexicano. And the mom might say, never forget that you're a Mexican American. And then a sister might say, no, 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 you're a Chicano. And then somebody else steps up and says, oh, no, you're Hispanic. And somebody else says, no, you're not Hispanic, you're a Latino. And it's interesting to ask how they identify themselves, because right within the family system, you have this incredible dynamic. And trying to kind of distill out what you're going to deal with, how you're going to deal with it, who has the bulk of the influence, and what role culture plays becomes a really, really critical issue for us as we dance with the family. So I'm going to scoot through some of this stuff that is, I think, more academic than anything else. And this is typically how we might define, and now some of this stuff I threw up here is researched, and I put some of the information up there. Other of this information you're going to find that it strictly comes from my experience. This is what I was talking about down here in terms of the awareness of the individual differences present in each person. And these are the three different dimensions that we look at typically from an academic perspective. The primary dimensions, as you can see on top, age, ethnicity, gender, and secondary dimensions, more economic, socioeconomic status. I would say without question, the two factors that I look at more than anything else are education and income. Those to me become critical. If you show me a family that is well educated, that has come here from another country, you know, a mom might be an attorney, dad's a physician, the kids come over here, the probability that they're going to have a difficult time acculturating goes down pretty significantly. But if you're dealing with a family where the mom comes over here, and she was typically the Latinos that come here come out of Michoacan, which is one of the states down in Mexico. So there's this huge conduit that comes over here. They arrive. Dad might have a second grade education, and his idea is, I'm going right straight out into the fields, and I'm going to do what I did in Michoacan. I'm going to work with my body. Mom has had the model of staying at home, having children, taking care of the home, and there's a real predictable kind of a classic traditional relationship between mom and dad. Then they get here, and what typically happens? Dad meets his agenda, and that is, I'm going to provide for the family, goes out into the field, works, perfectly comfortable working, takes great pride in putting in long days, working with the earth and working with the plants, comes home and feels fulfilled. What I've done is I've taken a step up, because I've taken my family out of Mexico. I now can buy a car, maybe, possibly buy even a house, but I'm providing for the family. Mom, on the other hand, decides that she wants to go to the JC and learn stuff. So she gets over to the JC and she learns stuff, and she hangs out with a bunch of Anglo females, and what happens? There's a sense of empowerment that she goes, you know, the stuff that I was thinking about before is really, really almost subservient. I don't want to just hang out around the house and take care of the kids. I think that what I want to do is really be bilingual. So I'm going to take a whole bunch of English classes, and there's a lot to be said for computer literacy. So she starts taking a bunch of computer classes and comes home to her second grade educated husband, and what does that feel like to him? Well, I'm losing all my power now. Nobody appreciates the fact that I am putting food on the table. And she's thinking, all I want to do is move our family forward. So she's taking one direction, he's taking a different direction, and they're not working with each other around that difference. Let me just shoot through some of this stuff, because I want to get over to so these are some of the different categories, and a lot of times we don't think about the differences in terms of what happens to folks when they come in. This is the case not just with Latinos, but anybody that comes here from another country. One is this category of marginality, where they're born in one culture and raised in another, but they're marginalized. And these are some of the problems. You become acculturated when you acquire the values of the dominant culture. But then that produces its own problems as well. The marginalization, I think, oftentimes when you see folks that are marginalized, I mean, if you look at them somatically, they just kind of walk around like this. There's just like the air is out of their sails. When you see folks that are acculturated, you can see this with the arriving generation in many instances, but typically you're going to see it with the second generation.
Well, I would really appreciate it if, as you're doing this excellent presentation, you could work in considerations of adolescent boys and gangbanging.
To try and tie some of that in. And I think I might be able to address that towards the end. When you look at the question that was asked was to speak a little bit about adolescent males and then particularly gang associations. And most of that is going to be not a function of culture as much as a function of power. If I'm brought here, my dad has a second grade education. My mom works at La Tortilla factory. I don't have a heck of a lot of power at school because I'm viewed as a Latino, and being a Latino is not a badge of courage here. So I go to school, I'm looked down upon, and if I have an accent because I came here at 12 or 13 or 14, it's even harder. So I'm having a difficult time identifying, but it's real easy to identify if I find other people that are having the same problem identifying. So within a neighborhood, in many, many instances, around 8 to 10, you're going to find that the kids begin to hang out. They have friends. And one of those friends gets into a gang affiliation. Could be typically here you find norteños and sureños. I think we have, when I was talking to the police department, close to 50 identified gangs here in Sonoma County. So what they do is they start hanging out with their friends. At a magic moment, they have to make a decision. And the decision is, are you in or are you out? So if you're in with your friends typically, because you go to a lot of these young kids and you ask them what a norteño is, they don't know. You ask what a sureño is, they don't have a clue. But they can tell you who's in this gang and who's in that gang. And these are my friends over here, so that's why I'm over here. I don't hear too much about jumping in. And occasionally some of the guys will have to jump in, but more often than not, it's I'm in because these are all my friends, and then they get affiliated, and if those kids are doing things where they're breaking the law, you begin to see the syndrome, and the syndrome is it's us and them. We are the gangbangers, and they are the Anglos, they are the police department, they are the teachers, they are the haves, and we're the have-nots. Now, for a young male, this can be a tremendous source of power, and especially if I'm an alpha male. So if I am an alpha male and I'm maneuvering comfortably around the group and everybody looks up to me, I don't have to make a big deal out of academics. I'm not going to compete with the kids that are doing their homework because I don't need to. I'm an alpha dog. The minute we get out of class, I know who's in charge, and it's me, and it's not going to be this kid that's being culturally or academically compliant. It's me. And oftentimes, if there's a legacy at home, it gets even more difficult because they come back and it's my uncle, who just got out of Quentin, that I grew up with, that I respect, is kind of taken me under his wing. And one of the tendencies that we have as humans is that we don't think about how we reinforce certain behaviors in our kids by simply saying stuff like, well, that's the Irish coming out in him. Yeah. Well, he's just like his dad, macho. And so the kids hear that stuff, and what we're doing is completely unintentionally reinforcing a lot of the negative behaviors that they're going to have to pay for later. The other category is assimilation. In this instance, you completely reject your culture of origin and you take on the other culture. The alteration, here you see this on occasion where folks are just kind of shifting back and forth, especially developmentally. You know, as a teenager, I'm going to identify myself more as a Mexican. Then all of a sudden, the latter part of adolescence, I shift. Nope, I like the idea of being called a Chicano. Then they shift again, they get into college and they say, wait a minute, you know, I think maybe I'm okay just being a Latino. And they're going back and forth. The difficulty is when they go back to their country of origin, because they know if I go back to Mexico, I can tell you with great confidence, they're not going to tell me I'm a Mexican. They're going to know that I have a Mexican heritage, but then when I start speaking with them, you know, who was I talking to, Bob? I get a kick of when I'm cruising around in Latin America and I have conversations with the folks, I can see this look of bewilderment. And they look at me and they go, where are you from? And so I always ask, where do you think I'm from? And some people will say Venezuela. Others will say maybe Spain, but not quite. And other times, and then if I tell them I'm a Texan, they go, no, it can't be. I said, that's true. And I was born right on the border, so I learned both languages at the same time. But my accent is kind of an interesting combination of learning Spanish as a child, then getting into high school and being exposed to Castilian, and then going into the service. And when I attended the Defense College, primary language there was Spanish. So I did Spanish for an entire year. The thesis was done in Spanish, but there was all of us from all of the Americas, and my language gets refined even further. But nobody says, well, Bob's a Mexican, because they know the minute I get there, at best, I'm going to be called a pocho. And a pocho means that you're really born here in the United States, but you've lost your Mexican heritage. Unless pocho, P-O-C-H-O, pocho. It's not a term of endearment. And the other one is a hybridization, where you design your own culture. And you decide, and you think, I'm just going to do my own, and I'm not going to get wrapped up around too much stuff. See, I'm going to shift through this because I want to get to some of the key domains. Now, one of the things, and I'll speak a little bit more about this later, is to, when you're doing a history, it's a great idea. How many of you folks do genograms? Okay, when you're doing the genogram, great idea to stick in there migration. And what you're going to ask is for the migration history. So if you're talking to somebody that came here from another country, the question you're going to ask is, why are you here? Typically, it's just a job commute. You know, I'm here because I have work. But what you're looking for is some of the underlying clinical stuff that's really, really rich when someone says, I've ran into trouble in my ranch. What happened? Well, I had a girlfriend there, and this happened. I've got a child that I've never seen, and you go, ah. So now you begin to look at stuff that clinically is going to be, I think, critical for you to consider, and that is, all right, this is somebody that has a child in another country, and could come back and say, and if I go back, her brother is really, really ticked off at me, so I run a good chance that I'm going to get killed if I go back there, because they never liked me, and I had a child with this guy's sister, and that family is violent. So you begin to look at that stuff, and you think, now this is an individual that's not coming to the United States, but he's moving from Nicaragua, and probably doesn't want to go back, but never wanted to be here in the first place. So now he's stuck. You know, that individual is caught between cultures, has no interest in acculturating at all, but at the same time, there's this kind of longing to go back, but this tremendous fear. So I'm going to speak a little bit more about, you know, the migration process, because there's some therapists now. When I first came into the field in the 70s, there was very, very little research, if any, being done with this population. About 10 years ago, I was down at Our Lady of the Lake University in Texas in San Antonio, and there's an entire graduate program, PhD program there, for Latinos that focuses on Latino research and Latino, and I got a real charge out of being there and listening to all these grad students presenting their research and their dissertation, and they study stuff. They'll take a real dinky issue like, what are the psychological issues that the arriving generation has on female identity or male identity? What's the role that, for example, one of the problems that we have is that parents arrive here, don't speak English, don't have much of an education. The kids get an education right around maybe even kindergarten, first grade. The parents begin using their children as negotiators. And most of us that were brought up that way didn't think about it. But now you have to ask yourself clinically, what happens if I am at age 6 used as a negotiator, and Dad takes me with him to go cut a deal for the rent on an apartment and tells me in advance, the reason, Bob, we're taking you is because you can speak English, and we want you to negotiate a deal, and we don't want to pay anything more than $700 a month. We can't afford anything more. So if you're successful, the whole family is going to benefit from it. But if you fail, beg your pardon?
That's a lot of pressure.
Oh, it's extraordinary. And I'm only 7 or 8 years old. That gets worse if Dad tells me we're going back to Michoacan and we want to go back in a truck of the current year. So I'm going to go buy me a Blazer. And you, Bob, are going to negotiate that deal. And you know how those salesmen are. They're really tough, but you're in the 3rd grade now. And we're going to, and so Dad's right behind me, and I know that I've got to cut this deal. And so I talk to the salesman, and the salesman, of course, tells me, let me talk to my manager. He turns around, and then I talk to my dad. If I don't get the deal that my dad wanted, all of a sudden I'm losing power in the home. But what happens if I do close the deal? All of a sudden I get kind of a distorted sense of worth. And then I go to school and I'm just an average student. At home, I'm a heavyweight because at 7, 8, or 9, I'm already controlling a tremendous amount at home. But then I get to school and I'm just a regular student, and people don't understand that I'm really important. So then as you move into adolescence and the kind of developmental issues that all of us run through in that period, now you've got somebody that's got a distorted sense of worth. The family's putting a tremendous amount of pressure on him or on her, and they're still trying to kind of cut the mustard themselves, but they can't because they've got this distorted sense of self. And these are just some of the different variables that I consider when I'm working with this population. Let's see. And this is one of the first kind of templates that I use. One is I'm always curious about the legal status, and it's always fascinating to me when I look at the legal status and they'll say, well, I'm not here legally. Matter of fact, I was working with a 16-year-old yesterday. He's not here legally. His younger brother is not here legally. His sister is here legally, and his mom is here illegally. And he's in a residential treatment program. And he's got probably, I don't want to say borderline intellectual functioning, might have like an 85, 90 IQ. Okay. But he's an alpha dog. So this is real interesting, because this is a kid that has a huge ego. And I asked him about how he felt about being in our program. He said, well, I don't like any of the rules. I don't like people telling me when to get up. I don't like people telling me when I can eat. And I'm not going to take anything from the kids here. If the kids start to give me any kind of crap, I'm taking them out. So this is a kid that has been on the street and has been somewhat successful at surviving because he's kind of a feral kid. And comes into a residential treatment program, and our focus there, more than anything else, is to impose rational behavioral controls. But you go to an alpha dog and you say, we want you up at this time, and you can't use these words, and we'd like for you to come into group therapy, and we're going to talk about feelings. I mean, talk about weird stuff. That's beyond odd. And then we have to impose on top of that, and because you're here illegally, the potential for you having to go back to Mexico is always there. And you can't get a driver's license. So don't think about driving. This kid's been driving since he was 9. So to tell him don't think about driving, it means absolute zero. So now, I sit down and I think, well, so legally, why are they here? Where did they come from? What was the cross like? And I'm always impressed when, especially females, that come across the border and are not harmed. I just cannot imagine being a young female that has to cross the border with a coyote, with a guy that's going to bring him across, and is not taken advantage of. It's extraordinary that they're able to do that. But the impact once they get here is that, okay, I'm not going to go back. I can go back in a minute, but then to come back to the United States is a huge grunt. I just can't jump in an aircraft, or I just can't cross down in Tijuana because of my illegal status. The age of the family members at the time of the immigration is kind of critical. As you do the genogram, you're taking a look at not only their age when they crossed, but what that experience was like. I worked with a gal last week, and she was telling me that I asked her what it was like crossing down in Tijuana. And she says, it was just not a big deal. I could see that my mom and my dad were really nervous, so they went in one direction, and then they gave me to another family. And this family took me across the border, and then I met my parents in some city later. But I don't remember having any kind of problems. Nobody bothered me. And I sit down and think, it's extraordinary that she was able to do that, clearly not traumatized, but now as she looks back on it, at 23 or 24, she's thinking, I'm wondering what was going on with mom. I'm wondering what was going on with dad. What price did they have to pay to come across, and they had to sacrifice in order to get me to come across. Health beliefs I'm going to get to a little bit later. The holiday and spiritual events, certainly, that's critical. As here in Sonoma County, you'll notice that there's this kind of migration right around Christmas. Everybody wants to go back there because of the Christmas holidays, and then also asking about the holidays in their own little villages because they're huge. And sometimes folks will leave and they'll say, I'm going down to this little village because they do this big thing down there. And the pressure sometimes on a marriage can be extraordinary because of old girlfriends or old boyfriends. And that's where all the socialization takes place. They go back to these incredible festivals, and the big deal is to hook up with old friends and then talk about how they're doing here in the United States. So these are some of the words that you'll hear. No pensar means to simply not think. One of the things you'll notice with folks that are not well educated is that they are very existential, and that is they live right in the moment. They're not wrapped up around. They're not thinking about retiring. They're not thinking about the educational process. They're thinking right in the moment. And they're thinking, we got food right now, the family is healthy, life is good. So I'm not going to worry too much about stuff. Lots of existential behavior with the no pensar. Aguantar, this idea of enduring in silence, and I'll speak a little bit about the differences, gender differences, because for males, there's a strong sense of kind of sucking it up when you're here. I come from, for example, I remember being brought up in Texas, right on the border there, the influence from the Mexican culture, of course, it's like, Laredo is like saying Healdsburg, and the Russian River is right there. The Rio Grande separates Nuevo Laredo, which has gotten a lot of notoriety because of the drug lords down there, and Laredo. So the Rio Grande separates Texas from Mexico. And I am the oldest male of my generation. My father is the oldest male of his generation. So we get this position of respect by virtue of being the oldest males. And I can remember when I was scooting down there with my wife, and of course she'd never been to Texas before, and I told her, I said, here's what you can expect. We're going to go down there. When we eat, typically the women like to prepare the food for the men. The men sit down and eat, and the women are kind of cruising over here by themselves, and then the women eat afterwards. And she said, well, that's really stupid. I said, maybe so, but it's the way that I was brought up, and people look up to me because I'm the oldest male, and also because of my education. So they look to Bob for advice, but they look to Bob just out of respect. And they do exactly the same thing with my dad. If my dad shows up, it's Beto, which is like saying Bob in Spanish. So they look at Tío Beto, Uncle Beto, with a tremendous amount of respect. And she said, so do you expect me to serve you? And I said, no. I said, if you want to, you can. I said, but it's not obligated, but I don't want you to make a big deal out of the fact that the women take great pride in doing that. Women take great pride in taking care of their men. Men take great pride in protecting the women. And that's just the way it is. So she said, well, I'm not going to do it. So I said, look, I said, don't roll over on me. If we go down there and you roll over on me, all you're doing is going against the culture. You're going to create a tremendous amount of tension, not only within the family, but then you're going to put me in a position where I'm going to be expected to confront you. And I don't want to do that. I don't want to be put in that position where all of a sudden the family's watching and saying, look at Bob's wife, she won't do anything for him. What kind of a woman is she? I don't want to get enrolled in that kind of stuff. It's much easier for us to have the kind of relationship that we've got that's based on mutual respect, but at the same time paying a lot of attention to the role that culture plays. And this is not a subservient position for women, because one of the interesting things that I noticed is that within a family structure, there's no rule that says that it's going to be paternal or maternal. There's no rule. It's almost like what alpha dog steps forward. All of a sudden, it's going to be this grandma that's in charge of everything, or this grandpa that's in charge of everything. And it's the level of respect that is given to that individual. So in some homes, you can go in there and you can see that it's dominated by a woman because of her wisdom, because of her experience, and because of her presence. Or it's going to be a male. But I've never seen that there is a rule that says one or the other. As much as I sit back, for example, within my family, my grandfather always was kind of the head of the family. Today, it's one of my cousins because she's got a really strong personality. So when I get there, I see that Connie, Chelito, everybody kind of scoots around her because she's kind of taken my grandfather's position. And everybody's okay with it.
What was the translation for fatalism?
On the bottom, please.
Where are you? Fatalism or resilience. It's kind of taking the position of, that's just kind of the way life is.
Palabra en español.
¿Cómo?
La palabra en español.
Así son las cosas. That's the way things are. It's aceptar. You're accepting the fact that's just the way things are. You take this kind of fatalistic approach. Así son las cosas. I know my mom, whenever stuff was destino también, it's kind of your destiny. It's kind of predetermined. My mom, regardless of what happened, would always say, there is no wrong that doesn't produce some right. So there was kind of this always optimistic role. And there would be horrible things that would be happening. I remember the family came down with polio, and even though we were dealing with an incredibly difficult circumstance, my mom's position was, no hay mal que por bien no venga. And that is, there is no wrong that doesn't produce some right. So these are the categories, the physical, social, and cultural problems in immigration. And this is the construction of the immigration narrative that I like. How did you make the decision to come to this country that I've spoken about? Who was left behind? Do they plan to come here? Do they worry about your health or safety? When you see folks that have come here under a significant amount of pressure, there's a lot of pressure being here. There's a lot of pressure back where they came from. So you find this incredible longing to want to go back. And as they go back and they try and relieve some of the pressure. But what ends up happening in many instances is that because they're not going to stay there, they create other problems. So they go back and they say, well, you know, my dad had some property and he's got a few cows and I want to go back and see how everything's being taken care of. They scoot back there and they find that somebody now, one of the relatives, is living in grandpa's house and the cows are gone. And so he's got to deal with that issue because those are resources, but doesn't have a heck of a lot of time and then comes back. And so the pressure is here, the pressure is there. Regardless of where I am, there's pressure. Now this at the bottom, of course, are you concerned about your legal status? The only way that you're not going to be concerned about your legal status is if you're ignorant. That's all I can figure. If you just simply don't know what that means. As you well know, Congress is in the middle of that bad boy right now. Just reading in today's paper that there's a possibility that here in California that undocumented folks are going to be able to get their driver's licenses. That produces tremendous problems. There's always going to be a bunch of folks that say it's stupid, and there's another bunch of folks over here that say it's a great idea, and we're going to have a lot of benefits from that. The issue of legality is extraordinarily complex because right within a family you're going to find some folks that are documented, some folks that are not documented. I do immigration evaluations. There's an interesting slice in the law that I was completely unaware of, but I had a friend of mine who's an immigration attorney contacted me and said, would you be willing to do some immigration evals? And I said, well, what are the circumstances? He said, here's the deal. If someone comes here to the United States and they have been traumatized, let's say somebody comes here and gets raped. So somebody gets raped and they report it. They report it and now they have some symptoms. And those symptoms could be acute stress, could be post-traumatic stress. Psychologist comes in, does an evaluation, does the assessment, and then in the recommendations portion, makes a recommendation that the person should stay here in the United States and why, or leave and why. So this woman that I worked with, for example, in one of the first cases, was molested here, raped here, by a family member who fled the United States, but she reported it. If you don't report it, then here in the United States, you're not viewed as a good citizen because you didn't report it. So I was raped 5 years ago. Is there a record? No. There's no record, then why not? Well, I didn't know. I'm undocumented. I was afraid. Psychologist's job is to determine if, in fact, that makes sense. If it does, that's included in your findings. But the critical thing was that this guy fled to Mexico, so would it be in her best interest to go back to Mexico? No, because the perpetrator was there. And better still, the perpetrator had threatened to hurt her if she did return to Mexico. So I submit that psych eval to the attorney. The attorney then takes that information, presents it to the federal government, and so now there's a possibility that she'll be allowed to stay here under what's referred to as a U visa. So she gets a U visa to stay here in the United States. Or if somebody is traumatized here and there's no treatment back in Mexico because they're out on a little ranch, or they're going to take the husband and they're going to send him back to Mexico, the question then becomes, what's going to be the impact on the children? So then my evaluation is not focused on the person that's being deported, but on the impact of the family. So then I would do the psych eval that reflects the impact on the children, that reflects the impact on the spouse, and indicates that it would not be in the family's best interest. And that's an interesting, complicated process, and I was completely unaware of it, but I probably get now 1 a month, 2 a month requests from attorneys that are saying, would you do this evaluation for this person because they possibly qualify for a U visa? This is part of the migration process that we spoke about earlier. Now one of the things that, to think about is it's real easy to lump us all in the category of being Latinos. But you have, as I mentioned early on, it's kind of important to ask how folks identify themselves and what country they came from. It's interesting to me how many individuals lump Latin America as this gargantuan category, and everybody that comes from Latin America is the same. And I sit down and think, well, until you get there. And then you get there and you think, well, what's going on between Chile and Argentina? Oh, there's this long battle that's gone on forever and ever. And what's going on with Venezuela and Brazil? Oh, this and this and this has happened. You look at all those countries, and every one of them has their own unique history, and you have to ask yourself, all right, what do I know about this country? What do I know about this person coming from that country? And is there a difference within the family? Are there 2 or 3 different countries that I need to consider? And this is some of the problems that I've noticed in terms of the reunion process, the disruption of the narrative coherence and loss of identity, how you just simply talk about what's happened to you. Over time, you sit down and your narrative changes. And I'm going to show you some of the research later that I just got this week that speaks about how we view ourselves when we're undocumented. Now, the truth or lies is always fascinating to me because, especially if it's a divorce issue, the husband takes off and goes back to Mexico for a short period of time. And I'll talk to the wife and ask, what do you think is going to go on? Well, he's going to go back and lie. I said, well, what's he going to lie about? Well, he's going to lie about how much money he's making. So he's going to drive back in a truck wearing some cool clothes, nice new boots, nice new hat, and then he's going to go back and talk about how much money he makes and how rich he is here in the United States. And you look at that and you think, what's going to be the impact from an ego perspective to have to lie about who you are, about what you do, and then go back and try and kind of create this fantasy of how successful you are in the United States. But interestingly, I also find that problem with Anglos that go there because they can't establish, especially the males, Anglo males that will go to Latin America to look for a spouse, a wife. And the 2 that I worked with, I think it was last year, goes down there and meets a woman, doesn't speak a lick of Spanish, she doesn't speak a lick of English, but in essence what he's telling her is what he's got here. And her position is he must be quite a guy. He's got a really good deal. I'm going to sneak off and look for my life in the United States. What she was doing is escaping Colombia. And she was escaping Colombia because of the drug business that was going on, but more importantly, a marriage that went south. So the marriage went south. She was heartbroken, hooks up with this guy thinking that he's got a heck of a lot, and he brings her here to a trailer in Cloverdale. It did not take her long to figure out that he was not at the top of the food chain. And so worse, as he was telling her that he was kind of successful in working at a store, what he did, because he had a serious social phobia, is that he would stock the Safeway shelves at night because he didn't like being around people. So now she has to deal with somebody that's got social phobia, somebody that's not terribly wealthy, and living out in a rural area in, did I say Cloverdale? Not Cloverdale, Clear Lake. Up in Clear Lake, out on a trailer in Clear Lake. So now they're up in a trailer in Clear Lake, and she was quite bright, well educated, and she scoots around and she starts looking, and one of the big pressures that came in was, well, how come you lied about what you were doing here in the United States? This doesn't sound to me like what you were portraying when we first met. And these are some of the transitional considerations. One of the interesting things that's happening with some of the Latino psychologists that I'm aware of is this transnational therapy, where somebody, say in Mexico, is in therapy with a psychologist over there, family is in therapy over here, so then we Skype. and I get an opportunity to work with that family at the same time that the therapist over there is facilitating those meetings. And we're able to do that because of the technology today. I mean, we certainly couldn't do that before, but it helps, although, you know, it's certainly not a solution, but technology is helping us a tremendous amount. And these are some of the symptoms that I've noticed, certainly. Depression, anxiety, psychosomatic illnesses. I'm also going to describe for you some of the generational differences, the differences in terms of emotional problems with the arriving generation, the first, second, and third generation as well.